This is the MTC Report, the news behind the news with journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield.
I've been criticized saying that, let me say it again, I believe health is a right of all people. I will fight for a Medicare for all single-payer system. Second of all, all right, you want to talk about rationing? You got 29 million people in this country who have no health insurance. How's that for rationing?
This is Mark Taylor-Canfield, and I'm reporting with the MTC Report on May Day 2017.
Using Powtoon.
Tonight, the traditional May Day protests took place in Seattle. Organizers estimated 50,000 people participated in May Day events today with multiple marches, including a peace march. And later in the evening, there was a confrontation between some Trump supporters and the protesters at Westlake Park, a traditional place for activism in Seattle. After several hours of confrontations and several arrests, the police declared a dispersal order and cleared Westlake Park, and that was the end of that confrontation. But in Portland and in Olympia, Washington, major confrontations took place between police and protesters, resulting in violence and arrests. So my story here in Seattle is that earlier today I testified before the Seattle City Council about press freedom. It's a major concern of mine, and I work with groups like, the Committee to Protect Journalists on this kind of issue. So I testified before the City Council today about this issue, and then later in the evening, after I covered the May Day protests in Seattle for several major news networks, and also the Thom Hartmann Show, the Goldman Show, KBOO in Portland, and other news affiliates, including Democracy Watch News, where I'm a contributing editor. After all of this, I was attacked by a bottle from a car that drove by me very fast. And so some people have been suggesting that that was retaliation for my role as a journalist during these protests. But I find no evidence to that. And if people want to, pursue that possibility, that's their business. But I'm not going to make any statements without evidence. I had actually previously walked by a group of Trump supporters who were still hanging out after police had dispersed them from Westlake Park. Luckily, I had a heavy jacket on, so it protected me, and I was not seriously injured. But I did report about it because that was part of my experience.
A pattern of divisiveness, of a very dark and in many ways dangerous vision where he incites violence.
day started very early this morning with a report for the Thom Hartmann Program out of Washington, D.C.
Mark Taylor-Canfield in Seattle, Washington. Hey, Mark, how's the reporter business doing?
Well, May 3rd is actually World Press Freedom Day, and the theme is Critical Minds for Critical Times. So I wanted to make sure that people understood that. That's a UNESCO-sponsored series of events. But here in Seattle, I'm getting ready to go report on the May Day protests for Democracy Watch News at Twitter and Facebook so people can follow what's happening here. But they're expecting 50,000 people, Tom, which is unheard of. I've never seen a May Day celebration with this many people. And all I can say is two things. One, a lot of it has to do with the resistance to the Donald Trump administration and the anger out there. But also, you know, I'm going to be speaking before the city council here in about an hour and a half about restraint on the part of the police department, hoping that the flashbang grenades and the rubber bullets and tear gas and pepper spray isn't directed towards bystanders or journalists like myself. I think that's a real concern for us this year. And a lot of the reporters out on the street are very nervous about what could happen later this evening after the official march.
Wow.
So tradition in Seattle happens every year, but this year I think there's heightened tensions and a lot more people are going to be out on the streets. So we'll see what happens, Tom, and I can report back to you later in the week and give you an update on what happens here in Seattle as well as across the country on May Day.
Right, and just to put an exclamation point on all this, Reince Priebus has confirmed that the Trump administration has been holding conversations about how to repeal the First Amendment. I mean, they didn't put it in those words, but how to make it possible to sue journalists for saying things that the administration doesn't like, which is something we haven't seen in the United States since 1789. It lasted 2 years, the Alien and Sedition Acts. They repealed the day that John Adams left office, and after he had put about 20 journalists in prison, and a dark stain on the history of the United States. And, you know, let's hope that that doesn't repeat. Mark, you keep up the great work.
Good afternoon, everybody. Please be seated. Good afternoon. We'd like to start our meeting. Thank you for being here. The May 1st, 2017 full council meeting of the Seattle City Council will now come to order. It's 2:00 p.m. I'm Bruce Harrell, President of the Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Sawant. Here. Bagshaw. Here. Burgess. Here. Gonzalez. Here. Herbold. Here. Johnson. Here. Juarez. O'Brien. And President Harrell.
Here.
7 present.
Following Joanna will be Mark Taylor-Canfield.
Hi, my name is Mark Taylor-Canfield, and I'm a journalist here in Seattle. I've written at the Huffington Post, and I'm currently coordinating editor for Press Freedom at Democracy Watch News and the International Media Alliance. So I'm here today to talk about press freedom and World Press Freedom Day, which is actually on May 3rd, as declared by UNESCO. I write about these issues a lot at Daily Kos, and I also have a column at Capitol Hill Times where I've been discussing these things. But I'm covering the May Day events here in Seattle for major national media programs. And on this day, I'm thinking about press freedom. I'm thinking about things that have happened with the Trump administration and how he didn't show up at his own honorary press event the other day. And I'm also thinking about Reporters Without Borders, which just recently released their 2017 World Press Freedom Index. And guess what? The United States has declined once again on their ranking. We are now 43rd in the world in terms of press freedom. And Reporters Without Borders explained this by saying that one of the things they have a problem with is that in the United States, there are no laws to protect journalists from revealing their sources, so they don't have that blanket protection here. Also, there have been many journalists who have been arrested while covering major protests over the last few years, including Democracy Now!'s Amy Goodman. So given that, and given the fact that today is May Day, I wanted to report that in past events, reporters have been injured by crowd control devices deployed by the Seattle Police Department, including Seattle Times reporter Paige Cornwall, who was burned by a flashbang grenade a couple years ago, and also Hannah Scott was pepper sprayed by police. She worked with ABC News, and that was in 2013 on the May Day events. So police training must include the protection of the rights of journalists to be there and document on what's happening at these protests. And I have been subjected to pepper spray and flashbang grenades myself while covering protests in Seattle. The city of Seattle should adopt a policy and a resolution protecting the rights of journalists at these events, protecting them from arrest
wrap up, please?
and from dangerous crowd control devices. And I hope during today's protests that will be uppermost in the minds of law enforcement and our city officials. Thank you.
Okay. So.
Violence in Olympia. Protesters clash with police. And businesses bear the brunt of the frustration. Police at the ready in Seattle as hundreds take to the streets. Tonight, the new message some were getting across during May Day 2017.
KBOO 7's Henry Rossoff is live at Westlake Center in Seattle, where most of the activity actually involved those who came out to oppose a pretty sizable pro-Trump rally today. Henry?
I can tell you I've been marching with the May Day crowds in Seattle for 4 years now, and this was a very different May Day in Seattle. Most of what did and did not happen revolved around those conservative, pro-Trump, pro-police crowds that gathered here at Westlake to counter the more liberal immigration and labor opinions that we hear during the day, and the more extreme anarchy, breaking of windows and that sort of thing that we normally see at night.
We want to be correct, not politically correct!
Hundreds of pro-Trump protesters went face-to-face with about a dozen or so anti-Trump protesters that also showed up to Westlake. Police quickly got between the two sides. Then we saw this arrest. Police say the man was throwing rocks at the pro-Trump protesters.
We're here to show what we believe in, just like they are, and they should come down here and show what they believe in without destroying property.
Eventually, the conservative crowd marched through the city's streets, down to Sodo and back to Westlake. Waiting for them were more anti-Trump protesters and some wearing masks. At first, everyone remained peaceful. A few pro and anti-Trump protesters even rolled joints together on the back of a sign. But eventually, tempers flared. After a few scuffles, police gave the order to disperse. The OC spray was at the ready, though it was never used. We saw one arrest made, but people still lingered on street corners near Westlake. As the evening dragged on, there was more pushing and shoving. Officers arrested 2 more people. Then police aggressively began splintering the crowd, clearing sidewalks and streets, creating several smaller groups. The Trump supporters were long gone at this point, though a few in black masks remained.
We're not expecting to change anything tonight, but we are showing that there is still some form of resistance.
And breaking apart the crowd at the end there really did finish off what was left of the protests and demonstrations, although I would say a few dozen, perhaps upwards of 60, 70 police officers did remain here at Westlake into the evening, but we haven't seen anything since, I would say, a little before 9 o'clock. Live in Seattle, Henry Rossoff, KBOO 7 News.
Okay, Henry. Yeah, we saw a few fights and some arrests tonight.
Once upon a time, there lived a group of people with amazing superpowers. They called them the Superdelegates. These super beings were like judges who got to decide who should be nominated as candidate for U.S. president. Meanwhile, surprise candidate Bernie Sanders came out of nowhere and began attracting huge crowds at stadiums and arenas across the country. Thousands of new young voters joined the party, and it truly was a party. For hero Bernie Sanders.
the mean streets of New York to the hills of Los Angeles, a voice is rising to serve justice.
This is a budget deal that's a bipartisan win.
This is the Norman Goldman Show.
We will rise up. We will rise
the home
up.
of fierce independence, intelligent dialogue, and passionate logic is right here, right now.
We'll build a wall, folks. Don't even worry about it. Go to sleep.
America, this is the dispenser of fairness. This is the unfiltered truth. This is Norman Goldman.
And I hope you had a very nice weekend. Got a little exercise, perhaps, marching around. Francis and I, we were rallying.
We will rise up. We will rise. We will rise up.
There you go. A lot of people, a couple 100,000 or more in Washington, D.C. at the People's Climate March. We rallied here in L.A. right down by all the refineries in the South L.A. area. There were rallies and demonstrations, protests everywhere, and it seemed like there was a corporate media blackout of the thing. Now, on Saturday, there was a good deal of coverage, but come Sunday, look, there wasn't that much going on. We didn't go to war or anything. Come Sunday, there seemed to be a media blackout, but a lot of people are very, very enraged and very, very engaged, and we're seeing it now, and that means you and I have one heck of a show. A very happy May Day to you. Yes, this is May 1st. If you're with us on WCPT, of course, in Chicago, I know you're thinking about the Haymarket Affair, right? May 4th, actually, 1886. Labor demonstrations, violence, dead people, and so May Day, but May Day has been around a long time. International Workers' Day, right? May Day. A lot of commies enjoy May Day, but it is, of course, May 1st, and I do thank you so much for being with me. And hey, look, on the bright side, we survived the first 100 days. I mean, come on now.
Hello.
We survived the first 100 days, and in fact, we are thriving. And the reason we're thriving is our word of the day today. I don't often do words of the day. It's just as appropriate. And it seemed to me this first kind of business day back after the 100-day mark on Saturday and the People's Climate March and all seemed to me we should really have a word of the day that sums up how we got here and where. I'm not just talking about the short term. And the word of the day, therefore, is revulsion. Because people are revulsed by Donald Trump. They really, really are. That's our word of the day, revulsion. You don't get enormous crowds the day after an inauguration. You don't get continuing demonstrations like April 15th, release your taxes. You don't get hundreds of thousands and millions of Americans marching and demonstrating almost every weekend now all over the United States and all over the world unless there is revulsion towards the guy that they're demonstrating against. And that's the word of the day because he is sparking revulsion. And that is our word of the day. But there's a lot going on in terms of the civics that flow from that, and I want to get started with civics. I do have senior legal analyst time for you in an hour, and in fact, let's start with the senior legal analyst time today, which is an hour from now, which is more civics than law, but it's definitely senior legal analyst time because Reince Priebus, he is the White House chief of staff.
I think that newspapers and news agencies need to be more responsible with how they report the news. I think this is a frustration of unnamed.
We need many of them to start running for school boards, city councils, county commissions, state.
From Seattle, good afternoon, sir.
Hey.
Yeah, you sound fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm at the May Day protest. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield. So I'm reporting live from Seattle. I don't know if you can hear the helicopters and the chanting behind me.
Oh, we hear you. We hear you and what's behind you. Don't worry. Go ahead.
There's got to be at least 50,000 people out here, Norm. It's huge. It's the biggest May Day march I've ever seen. And it seems like everybody has come together, all the labor unions, the immigrants' rights, the teachers, the tech workers. Everybody's out here. And you were talking earlier about press freedom, which is a big theme of today, because earlier today I was speaking before the Seattle City Council on this very issue, because May 3rd is World Press Freedom Day. And even though you probably won't hear much about that through the U.S. media, it is a UNESCO-declared day of action for world press freedom. And the theme this year is Critical Minds for Critical Times, which is exactly what we need in journalism today. We also have this report that just came out, the World Press Freedom Report by Reporters Without Borders, ranking the United States 43rd. So we dropped a couple notches more because of the arrest of journalists at protests like today, and because there's no shield law for journalists in the United States. We have no protection in terms of trying to protect our sources. So I was talking to the city council about that, and I'm hoping, Norm, that today the flashbang grenades and the pepper spray and the rubber bullets or whatever will not be directed towards the media as in past instances when folks at the Seattle Times reporter Paige Cornwell got seriously burned by a flash grenade. And I've also experienced that as well, as you know, kind of a tradition for me to call your show on this day. But I've experienced the pepper spray and the flash grenades at times when I thought it was inappropriate and not safe for either the public or for journalists who were trying to cover the event. So I'm trying to get a message to the city council today that whatever happens during these crazy times in Seattle, which usually turns into kind of more like riots later in the evening, I'm hoping that the law enforcement and the city officials will think very circumspectly about the use of crowd control devices on bystanders or people that are completely nonviolent, and especially the press.
Well, Mark,
so that's my report from Seattle, Norm.
I appreciate it very much. That is Mark Taylor-Canfield, and thank you very much, Mark, for calling from Seattle. And I perceive that we are getting a blackout here from the corporate media, and it's not the first time. There was a weekend a few weekends ago when it looked like Donald Trump was about to attack North Korea, and all of a sudden the American press just blacked out on the thing, and I had to get my news from overseas, from the internet, and British and all kinds of foreign press that were talking all about North Korea and trying to move 150,000 troops. There's something weird going on in the American media. Maybe they're intimidated by Trump or something. They're trying to offer him some olive branches. But But
the massive confrontations between police and protesters and the long drawn-out marches never happened. KBOO 7's Gary Horker is live outside the King County Juvenile Justice Center, which plays a part in why these marches didn't happen as expected. Gary.
Well, the protest was directed right here at the cell block walls of the Youth Detention Center here in Seattle all night. Now, having covered every Seattle May Day march since the first violent, destructive one 6 years ago, you can imagine my skepticism when the organizers told me they were not going to march, not going to destroy property, but in fact they were going to, quote, chill the cops out. But they were right. They gave SPD flanking this place nothing to do all night but watch. The violent march Seattle has come to expect every May Day never materialized, and protesters tell us it was planned that way.
We know that every May Day the pigs run around, chase us, beat us up. So we didn't want to do that this year.
And so today, these organizers decided we would come together on this block. We would sing songs. We would make music.
Put your hands in there. You want to leave them there. Leave them there. Keep them there. Keep them there.
And that's exactly what happened. The music was aimed right at the walls of the youth detention cells so those incarcerated inside could hear them. The protest was against what the building represents.
Now here's a place you always meet a lot of friends.
The time is 5 minutes after 5. You're listening to KBOO Portland. Coming up next is the KBOO Evening News.
The KBOO Evening News.
Coming up on the KBOO Evening News, May Day protests have been going on around the world, so we have live reports from Seattle and from here in Portland.
And we have an update on last week's story on Nightcore and ICE.
And at the end of tonight's newscast, in our in-depth report, we will have the punk band Tall Woman live in studio, so be sure to stay tuned for that.
Good evening. This is the KBOO Evening News for Monday, May 1st, 2017. I'm Ken Jones.
And I'm Natalie Motti. There are May Day protests happening around the world and throughout the U.S. KBOO reporter Teresa Mitchell was at Portland's May Day protest earlier today. We'll have more from the protest in Portland later on in this broadcast.
It's Mark Taylor-Canfield reporting for KBOO and for, of course, as a journalist in Seattle on the May Day protests in Seattle.
Hello, Mark.
Hey, happy May Day.
So what's going on over there in Seattle right now? Can you tell us what's happening?
Well, there was a huge march. Organizers estimated over 50,000 people were going to participate in these series of events. So there were separate marches coming from all sorts of different parts of the city, including a peace march that met the larger group at Judkins Park in the Central District of Seattle, and then folks marched all the way through First Hill, down through downtown Seattle and to Seattle Center, where the Space Needle is located, where there's now a big rally going on, and local labor leaders and immigrants' rights groups are speaking, and some of our local political representatives like City Council member Shama Sawant. So it was a huge crowd. There were many contingents, including teachers, tech workers, students, environmentalists, civil rights organizations, socialists, immigrants' rights marchers. And I think the numbers are part of the momentum that came from the National Women's March here, where some estimated over 130,000 people actually participated in Seattle. So, and that march also went to Seattle Center. So Seattle Center, unlike Westlake Park, which used to be the major location for protests, especially during the Occupy movement, that convergence space now looks like it's Seattle Center because it can hold a lot more people. Westlake Park can hold maybe 5,000, so there's no way that they could get even a small portion of these people into that area. So everybody's at Seattle Center right now. And of course, Seattle has a tradition of a lot of more aggressive protests that take place later in the evening. And so the local media here has been talking that up because I think, the corporate media, they love the pictures of burning dumpsters and broken windows. But so far, everything is peaceful. And there is an issue I was hoping to mention, which is that freedom of the press has been sort of an issue at some of these marches because during the protests, some journalists who are covering the marches have been arrested or have been struck by flashbang grenades or pepper sprayed, including folks like myself. So earlier today, I actually spoke before the Seattle City Council and asked for some restraint. And also I called for a city resolution by the City Council to adopt principles on how to protect journalists in Seattle, especially during these protests, because Seattle Times reporter Paige Cornwell was injured pretty seriously a couple of years ago with a flashbang grenade. Our City Council member Bruce Harrell, who the chairperson of the Public Safety Committee, said they just need to stop using flashbang grenades because they're so dangerous. But there's a lot of crowd control devices that the Seattle Police Department tends to deploy during these protests later in the evening during the anti-capitalist marches. And in the past, they've proven to be dangerous to bystanders, protesters, and journalists like me. So I'm speaking out on that partly because May 3rd is World Press Freedom Day. And the theme this year is Critical Minds for Critical Times. And there are some UNESCO-sponsored events that are happening in Europe, but you probably won't hear anything about it in the mainstream corporate media in the United States. You probably also won't hear that Reporters Without Borders in their 2017 recently released World Press Freedom Index ranks the United States as 43rd in the world in terms of press freedom, dropping another couple of points down that ladder since the Trump administration. And also there were complaints from Reporters Without Borders in their report about the arrest of journalists at protests, and also the fact that there is no shield law for journalists in the United States. So there's no protection for them in terms of being forced to reveal their sources. So those are 2 points, along with others, including the attitude of our current commander-in-chief, so to speak, Donald Trump, who has shown total disregard for the press, is talking about trying to challenge the First Amendment and didn't even show up at the press event that was held for him in his honor the other day as a boycott. So we have some serious issues with freedom of the press in the United States, but it's not being reported on by the corporate news media. They don't like to report on information that undermines their own credibility, of course. So you really have to listen to groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Reporters Without Borders and groups like that are really on top of this issue around the world, not just in the United States.
Mark, have you experienced any obstacles today in covering the march in Seattle?
No, because it was a very well-organized parade march route. And so the only thing that I encountered which was a little possible precursor of things that could happen later on in the evening, is that there are riot cops blocking the entrances to Interstate 5. At least there were when the march went through downtown. I suspect they're probably still in the area. But there are the ever-present riot cops in Seattle with their big clubs and body armor stationed at the entrances to I-5. So other than that, I haven't seen any incidents. I haven't been blocked from reporting on anything at this point. But usually it's later in the evening when things get more aggressive, and that's when the police tend to start shutting down streets and using the pepper spray to clear areas and things like that. So we'll see how that goes.
We've got
peaceful.
Oh, so Mark, I just want to let you know that we've gotten reports that the protests in Portland have turned violent in places, and the police have actually called it off at this point. And there's been reports of tear gas and other riot gear used by the police against protesters.
Well, thank you for that tip, and I will definitely check on that and try to get some sources so I can report that. I appreciate that. I really think people up here are concerned about what happens in Portland as well. In a lot of ways, especially when it comes to activism, they are kind of sister cities in a lot of ways. So there's a strong Northwest connection going on here. Similar politics, similar style culture. So I hate to hear that police are resorting to crowd control devices, because as I testified earlier today, and by the way, as the California Park Police captain said just the other day, pepper spray is very dangerous and can lead to permanent damage. And that is considered, as far as I can tell, by the Seattle Police Department on the lowest level of force used when it comes to crowd control measures. That's usually the first thing they pull out. That doesn't even include the rubber bullets and the other projectile weapons that are fired on the crowd, or these flashbang grenades, which cause serious problems. Can damage your hearing if they land close to you, can burn you seriously because they are incendiary devices that send out superheated sparks. So the problem in Seattle in the past at May Day was that, and I do document this at my YouTube channel, is that they were throwing some of these devices into an area right in front of the police line where there were almost no protesters, mostly camera crews, journalists. So that's where I sort of decided that, I'm going to have to bring this issue to the public forefront in Seattle. And I, have had positive response from city council members. So it's not like something that the city council doesn't support or the mayor's office wouldn't support. It's just trying to implement some kind of citywide protection. And I hope that's not happening in Portland, where a lot of times reporters get the brunt of the crowd control devices or are blocked from getting into areas. That has been an issue for me in the past here. Where
Steve, this started
now here's the place. You always need a lot of friends.
It wasn't a clash with police. It was a clash with people on the street here in downtown Olympia that lashed out at the demonstrators.
This was the moment the May Day march through downtown Olympia turned into a riot, when an angry confrontation between black-clad demonstrators and self-described street people turned violent. People became upset with a group of about 60 marching through downtown Olympia after they left piles of trash in the street and caused havoc in an area frequented by young homeless people.
Get out of the street!
Police moved in using flashbang grenades along with plastic bullets to push the demonstrators through downtown. At one point, protesters and residents began throwing rocks at one another until police came to break that up. Minutes later, demonstrators were breaking out windows of several businesses.
At the U.S. Bank, stay back, that's not safe.
Including a U.S. Bank and a Starbucks, setting off loud fireworks as they moved through downtown.
That's good. Hey, give me, hey.
The march finally came to an end with at least 8 people taken into custody as residents watched from behind police tape. Many cheered the officers and were angry at the group of disguised May Day marchers.
And although some of those marchers were taken into custody, most of them got away. We heard reports from Olympia police that they found those black disguises they were wearing. They took them off, threw them away in alleys, and then blended in with the crowd. Live in Olympia, Kevin McCarty, Cairo 7 News.
All right, Kevin on the scene for us all evening there. Kevin, thanks. Meantime, Cairo 7's Joanna Small is also live in Olympia with an up-close look at the damage. Joanna.
Steve, we just heard from Kevin McCarty just how violent things got, and I want to show you some of the aftermath of this. This is Starbucks. It's on Capitol Avenue and Legion Way. Walk around the corner with me here, and you can see that several windows were damaged and some were smashed out. There's still glass all over the floor inside the Starbucks, and it's still being considered a crime scene tonight. There's also demonstrators also vandalized an Olympia Federal Savings, smashing out and damaging several very large windows. By 10 o'clock, workers had them all boarded up, but we arrived while they were still in the process. At a news conference about an hour and a half ago, the Olympia police chief addressed today's violence, explaining that while it was not necessarily expected, they were prepared.
Our last really big incident was probably 2013, and so we really have not, we've always staffed for those events, and frankly, the information that was available to us out there on social media and whatnot really wasn't substantial.
The chief said 9 officers have what appear to be minor injuries. Protesters were armed with makeshift weapons, including marbles, which officers say were fired from slingshots. Now, although Olympia police are fairly confident that things have wrapped up for this evening, they still have police officers and officers from other departments, such as the Thurston County Sheriff's Office, which you see here, placed strategically around the city just to ensure that no further damage is done. Live in Olympia, Joanna Small, Cairo 7 News.
Those were the problems in Olympia.
This is the MTC Report, the news behind the news with journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield.
I've been criticized saying that, let me say it again. I believe health is a right of all people. I will fight for a Medicare for all single-payer system. Second of all right, you want to talk about rationing? You got 29 million people in this country who have no health insurance. How's that?
Don't go anywhere. The MTC Report with Mark Taylor-Canfield continues next.
Another election, another convention, another media intervention, another reason, another season to vote for Bernie.
It's not one thing. This is a pattern of divisiveness, of a very dark and in many ways dangerous vision of our country where he incites violence. Time Donald is pushed on something which is obviously uncomfortable, like what these women are saying. He immediately goes to denying responsibility. And it's not just about women. He never apologizes or says he's sorry for anything. I hope that as we move in the last weeks of this campaign, more and more people will understand what's at stake in this election, it really does come down to what kind of country we are going to have.
So sad when she talks about violence at my rallies, and she caused the violence.